Welcome to the Sound of Economics. My name is Guntram Wolff and I'm the director of Bruegel, and it's a pleasure to host today Bruegel's podcast. And today we are talking about the RCEP, a major trade agreement. It is one of the world's biggest free trade deals that was just signed. It takes most of the existing agreements signed by the 10 members of the ASEAN countries and combines them in a single multilateral pact with Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. So this is obviously a trade agreement that is huge. It covers a huge part of the world economy, an even bigger part of world growth. And China is, of course, the biggest country in that trade agreement. And I'm so pleased today to discuss this with three prominent Bruegel scholars. All have been working on these issues from different perspectives. I'm welcoming Uri Dadush, Alicia Garcia-Herrero, and Suman Bery, who will all bring their perspectives. And thank you all for joining us today. I want to start with you, Uri, to perhaps first give us a short description of what this RCEP is before we analyze what it all means. But first, what is it really, this RCEP trade agreement?
Well, RCEP is a regional trade agreement, actually a mega regional trade agreement that has been signed, and it needs to be ratified between the 15 countries that you mentioned. It is what's described generally as a low-quality trade agreement, by which is meant that the tariff reductions that are implicit in the agreement are modest. They have many exclusions by country, and they also don't add as much as you would expect, very simply because it comes on top of already existing free trade agreements. So there are important aspects of trade, such as agriculture, that are barely included, and the agreement on services is based on a positive list, which means that it is only affecting some sectors in some countries that are actually explicitly stated and not the other way around. And it has some regulatory and rules embedded in it, for example, on trade facilitation, operation of customs, etc., etc. But by and large, it is a much lower quality agreement than the CPTPP, which was originally the TPP with the United States, which covers a much broader ground and is much more ambitious. It is also lower quality, of course, than the new USMCA agreement linking Mexico, Canada, and the United States, and it is incomparably lower quality than the customs union in Europe, of course, with all its implications. So it has to be seen for what it is. However, the RCEP exhibits two very important features which people around the world need to look at. I'm talking now from the economic point of view. There are also very important political implications of RCEP, which I'm sure we'll get to. On the economic front, the first feature that is critical is that this represents the first free trade agreement between China, Japan, and South Korea. Now, together, these three have a value added in manufacturing, output in the manufacturing sector, which is over $5 trillion. And that's about $1 trillion more than the United States and the European Union combined. So RCEP has the potential of sort of strengthening the central core of global manufacturing across these three countries, with China, of course, playing the more important role. And the second aspect, which is closely related, is that RCEP harmonizes rules of origin, which across the 15 countries, which, of course, will facilitate in many ways the operation of global value chains. Now, this is especially important in the case of RCEP, not only because it's such a huge manufacturer, but also because there is enormous diversity of economic situations across RCEP. So there's tremendous possibility with very different factor endowments and levels of wages across RCEP there is enormous potential for specializing the value chains along lines of comparative advantage and improving efficiency. Something like this is observed in the USMCA with location of manufacturing in Mexico, and of course in the European Union with location of manufacturing in Eastern Europe. But in the case of RCEP, these possibilities are even greater, especially given the size of the population. That's the big picture on the economic side, and I think I should stop there.
Thank you, Uri. I think that was a great overview. Just to push you perhaps a bit more, and then I want to turn to Alicia, but to push you a bit more on the assessment side. You made clear that it's important for the manufacturing sector that key countries, actually bigger than the US and Europe together, will join in this free trade agreement and will be able to trade more freely. At the same time, you highlighted it's the so-called low quality. And of course, low quality is a term that, needs a definition. I think not every listener will understand what you mean with low quality. I understand a significant element is tariff reductions at this stage. And that matters in particular if countries have high tariffs at this stage. So if you could just give us a sense of the estimates. There were a few studies. Michael Plummer from Johns Hopkins University has made some estimates. If you have those estimates at hand, give us an assessment of the likely trade gains that you see or that Michael Plummer is seeing from this.
Yeah. From memory, and it isn't just the Plummer and Petrie estimates, because these were sort of put together before the agreement was even known. But also what is now known about the agreement is that significant parts of manufacturers are excluded from trade liberalization depending on the country. So I don't remember the exact numbers, but some 10 to 15% of sectors are excluded in the total. Now, for people who don't follow international trade, that sounds not like a lot, but in fact, it is a lot, because what is excluded typically are sectors that are sensitive, which also means that they are sectors that are not generally covered by preceding trade agreements. And that means that the incremental liberalization of RCEP is actually quite limited. In terms of welfare gains, which are estimated, for example, by Plummer and Petrie, they are estimated to be large in absolute terms, but very small in relative terms, relative to the enormous size. This is about 1/3 of world GDP we're talking about. And the estimates are around $180 billion of global welfare gains emanating from the agreement, somewhere in that region, which is a tiny proportion of the region's GDP, and which anyway has to be taken with a grain of salt because there are a lot of assumptions underlying these kinds of estimates. But it looks like in absolute terms, China will be the biggest gainer, as you mentioned, in part because China has quite high tariffs, around 9% MFN applied tariff, and has relatively few agreements with the other countries already. And China is, of course, the biggest economy, so you expect the biggest absolute gains. But in proportional terms, relative to GDP, several of the smaller countries, particularly those in Southeast Asia, gain more. I think for a European audience, what is important also is the calculation that they make, which again has to be taken with a pinch of salt, about what the effects are on European welfare of the RCEP. And it turns out that they see a very tiny, small positive effect on Europe, amounting to 0.1% of European GDP. And you have to ask, well, how do you get that? Because you would expect many European companies to lose business as a result of RCEP. It's called trade diversion, particularly on the Chinese market, which is very important for Europe. And where, as I said, because the tariffs are high, the preference margins that will be accorded to Japan and Korea and others that compete with Europe will be quite high. And the reason you might get a positive outcome for Europe is that actually European consumers and European importers will benefit from the increased efficiency and lower prices of firms that are based in RCEP. That's the main reason. And some European exporters will gain by virtue of the fact that the RCEP becomes, a bigger economy grows a little faster as a result of the trade agreement.
Thank you, Uri. Let me turn to you, Alicia. I mean, you've been following this actually not from Washington, where Uri is based, but from Hong Kong, where you are based. Very different worldview, I guess. And you've studied in particular how this affects production patterns or so-called value chains in Asia. So what's your take on RCEP in terms of really how it shapes economic trade in the region, but also globally?
Well, I'd like to step up a little bit to answer that question, Guntram, because I guess we need to figure what has happened with value chains lately in Asia. And there's one obvious trend, which is China's central role in the value chain, which doesn't mean it's the biggest, because when we look at actual size of exports of intermediate goods or imports of intermediate goods for re-export, Europe is by far bigger. But the point is, China has been increasing that participation in the value chain very fast, while others have been losing ground, by the way, Europe. But the point is now ASEAN with China, ASEAN with Japan, ASEAN with South Korea, by the way, ASEAN with Taiwan, which is not in the deal and was in the TTP. And I think this is the kind of how to look at this thing, because even the way the chapters are written, and Andres Sapir reminded us, and it's very important, you have ASEAN as a bloc, and it's like a deal written for South Korea with ASEAN, Japan with ASEAN, China with ASEAN. It's like sharing ASEAN. By the way, one is excluded. I would not repeat which one because I'm sure you got it. So it is a very interesting deal, because to me what it means, and this is why rules of origin is so important, more than tariffs, because it's all about how we make ASEAN a huge manufacturing platform, given that, and by the way, this is already the flying geese, yeah? I mean, we need to go back to the 80s for Japan, then South Korea, now China. And as China moves up the ladder, and especially, given that they've announced 20,000, they haven't said that, but that's how the market interprets it, $20,000 per capita by 2035, they need places where wages are lower from China's perspective. So I think what this is really, let's make ASEAN that platform for us. And by the way, Suman will mention, at the beginning, the platform probably looked even small for the size of these manufacturing economies, and India was, a possibility. We'll hear from Suman, but I think that's the way to read this thing. Now, what I want to add to this story is that after what I said, the obvious step forward is to say it's all about China. China is going to have it all. But when one looks, at least so far, maybe RCEP will change this pattern. But when one looks at input-output data, so integration of value chain between Japan and ASEAN, South Korea and ASEAN, again, Taiwan and ASEAN, they're growing. And their investment, FDI into ASEAN, is growing. China isn't. Because China has integrated vertically so much, so far it hasn't really fully needed. Maybe they're thinking ahead and they realize they need ASEAN. But frankly speaking, Japan and South Korea are well ahead, as I mentioned, even Taiwan. So for me, the big winners are South Korea and Japan, if you ask me, in this framework. It may change, but for them, this is a big deal because they are having a much more homogeneous access to ASEAN, which wasn't there before. And I think that's very important. And I think that explains why they finally ended up signing a trade deal with China. I won't get into the geopolitics of the whole thing, but it is very, very important for them.
Before we want to ask what it means for Europe, can we enlarge a little bit on the regional dynamics, really? Because a lot of people that I talked to in the recent days, they were sort of raising the surprise why Japan and South Korea joined this agreement. And one interpretation is, well, it's all because China has become so important that even close allies of the United States decide that they cannot afford staying out of a deal with a mega trade deal with China at its center, because China is just too important. Now, you seem to emphasize much more the relation with the ASEAN, but can you just sort of walk us a bit through this argument?
So again, when one looks at FDI, inward FDI, so outward FDI from South Korea into China or ASEAN, since 2017, that flow of FDI is bigger into ASEAN than into China. That doesn't mean the Chinese market is not more important than ASEAN, but that's final demand. What I think South Korea and Japan were looking for, and therefore I don't think it's all about, I can't say no to China. I think it's more about, I'm interested in this deal. Because, you could argue Japan already had its deal. Of course, it wasn't China, but I think this gives access to the whole ASEAN. It's very important. I mean, it's a younger, except for Thailand and Vietnam, but for the rest, younger population, much lower wages than China. I think I fully agree with Uri, heterogeneity as well. So you can really explore, by the way, with much more control than if you were doing it in China, all of this value chain from your perspective. I think that's the key. Because what has changed, in my opinion, for South Korea and Japan versus China, I mean, market access, there's no difference. The degree of market access in China hasn't changed. So that can't be the reason for them to be enticed into this deal. But I don't think they would have gotten the same access to ASEAN that they have had with China. And the proof of the pudding is that Japan didn't manage. I mean, it was great, but it didn't manage to replicate a full TTP. And this is in terms of country coverage, bigger than TTP, ASEAN fully. So I think that's the way I would read it.
I have a question for Alicia. You said that market access of Japan and Korea, did I understand that right, in China doesn't change as a result of RCEP?
What I mean by market access is sector liberalization. It's not in... China is announcing sector liberalization multilaterally. For example, finance, autos. It's not using regional deals, and rightly so. I think it would make any sense to open your financial sector only to Japanese and South Korean banks.
I understand on the services side, but in manufacturing, are you saying that China is not lowering its tariffs, its MFN applied tariffs vis-a-vis Japan and South Korea?
No, what I mean to say is that that's trade. I'm talking about market access. I don't think the problem that South Korea and Japan face in China is tariffs. Say, let's take a German automaker as opposed to a South Korean automaker. The issue is not whether your tariffs might be 9% less, is that whether I need to go with a joint venture, what are the financial conditions for that? I mean, that's the key issue. And that doesn't change between South Korea and Germany now. What changes is at 9% or even less, because probably autos, I checked autos is much lower. The marginal effect is small. Right. It would be a big deal for them if they would have preferential access to the Chinese market, but that isn't in the deal. So that's what I'm trying to say, that for Japan and South Korea, what really changes is that if they want to produce in Vietnam and then re-export, whether to China as a final market or back to Japan, they're lower tariffs in intermediate goods. For me, that's the end game for them. And that's why they're signing a deal.
Uri, to react a bit to what you just heard, but also to give perhaps one or two thoughts on what you think this deal means for Europe. So Japan and South Korea get better market access to ASEAN and, can also face lower tariffs towards China. That leaves the EU out. And it leaves, of course, also the US out. And the US had tried under President Obama to get the so-called TPP agreement. That went nowhere under Trump. Obviously, it was withdrawn. Now the US is out, Europe is out, and in Asia there is a lowering of tariffs that helps producers in Japan, in South Korea, in China, but also in ASEAN to exploit these benefits. Now, even if there's some benefits for Europe, the gains are much bigger in Asia. So what is the implications? I mean, should Europe now try to have a deal with ASEAN, or where would you go?
Well, first, I tend to disagree a bit with Alicia. I think that the incremental market access of South Korea and Japan in China is very important given the size of the market and the size of the tariffs. Now, I haven't looked in detail at the tariff schedule, but I would be very surprised if the biggest gains actually are not in that trilateral relation at the moment. The second point that I would make is, bear in mind, this agreement has to be ratified in a very politically charged situation vis-a-vis China across the region. Okay, and that's going to take time and effort. And furthermore, once it is ratified, the tariff schedule has a very long implementation period of 20 years, which doesn't mean we wait 20 years to change tariffs, but it does mean that some of the more sensitive sectors will be liberalized very late in the game. So the message there is the Europeans and the Americans have some time to react, to think, and to know what to do. As far as the implications for Europe are concerned, I will focus on the economic implications, the very important geopolitical implications. But the economic implications are that some Europeans will gain, right? Never forget the consumer when you're talking about trade, because the consumer is the main gainer of trade. So there are those gains, but there are those potential competitive losses. And if you look at the region, there are actually several countries with which Europe already has a trade agreement, and that includes Japan and South Korea, very important markets, and Singapore. So in those markets, there is very little fear here of trade diversion, because Europe already has preferential access. And without looking at the details, it may even be possible that Europe has better preferential access than China and others will have under the RCEP low-quality agreement, but that would have to be checked. So you're not going to get much trade diversion there, but there are big markets where Europe does not have a trade agreement. First and foremost, that's China. And so that's where the bigger losses might be, especially since the South Koreans and the Japanese are, of course, in the same sectors as where much of Europe has a comparative advantage. Machinery, automobiles, electronics, etc., etc. That's the bigger game for Europe. And now, how should Europe react? Europe has many possible avenues, but this is again related to the geopolitics. But the simplest avenue is to accelerate the trade agreements that it is negotiating together with several of the RCEP countries with which it does not have a trade agreement. The second one is Europe may want to evaluate whether it can join the CPTPP, which is a regional agreement that already includes two world regions, right? North and South America on one side and Asia on the other. So can Europe be a third party in the CPTPP? That's another thing to consider. I haven't really given much thought to that, but it should be something that should be evaluated. And the third, which is the most problematic and has very important geopolitical implications, is to face up to the reality that all this talk about isolating China, interrupting the value chains in China, etc., is just shown to be nonsense now that Japan and Korea, US allies, have signed up to the RCEP. And so therefore then Europe needs to accelerate its efforts to work together with the Chinese with all the problems that we have to tighten the economic ties with China, whether through an investment agreement and one day perhaps a trade agreement. I just want to say that we are now in a situation where you have three very high-income countries that are very advanced that have a trade agreement with China, at least on paper. And that's Japan, South Korea, and Switzerland. And I don't mention some of the other high-income countries in Asia. And so if they can do it, okay, it's not a high-quality agreement that we're talking about. Can Europe make progress in that direction? And what's the geopolitical implication of that?
Thank you, Uri. So I want to bring in also Suman. You've been patiently waiting. Obviously, it is very interesting, and you usually sit in Delhi. It's very interesting to hear from you why India hasn't joined. I mean, India originally was scheduled to be part of this and only recently decided that it would not want to be part of it. And that, of course, has also implications for Europe and for the United States. And there is a big discussion here in Europe. By the way, I find the discussion in Europe actually to still be quite behind. I think a lot of people in the last months, at least, have just waited to see what is happening in the United States. Will we get a different president or not? And so the strategic thinking has been also a bit delayed in Europe on exactly this question. I think the options, Uri, that you describe, the option of engaging more with China, engaging perhaps with trade partners in Asia that are not China. So that's the old TPP idea, joining the CTPPP. Or, in fact, agreeing on something that would be against China, which is almost to say, well, perhaps we have a trade agreement with Japan, the United States, and Europe, and not with China at all. So these are various options that are out there and that need to be discussed and reflected on. But I think it would be really fascinating for our listeners to hear, Suman, why India in the end decided not to take part in this, even though it is a low-income country, and the benefits of trade when you have different income levels are actually bigger than when you are at a similar income level. So why, in the end, did India decide not to join?
So let me first talk about the timing of the decision to withdraw and then place it against a larger background, both security as well as economic. So the decision was taken in November, exactly a year ago, at the last ASEAN summit, and was taken by Prime Minister Modi himself. 2019 is important because that was the year when Modi was re-elected to the second term, and we saw a whole wave of decisions, political, which were, in a sense, driven by the need for Modi to, as it were, satisfy the agenda of his right-wing Hindu nationalist base. Okay, I'm saying all this because we've had our own difficulties with China on the border in 2020, but I do want to point out that the decision to withdraw was in 2019. And what are some of the drivers of this? India, a bit like Japan, actually was very comfortable to operate under WTO disciplines for a long time. People will remember that Japan came fairly slowly to the FTA or the RTA table, and India similarly so. There has been an anti-trade agenda in the ideological wing of the party that supports the BJP. And there was a review done of existing bilateral FTAs, which India has with Korea, Japan, Singapore, because the argument was that India had suffered from those, and attempts have been to renegotiate bilateral investment treaties to review these FTAs when the review time came up. Let me just say that India's running sore economically has been its poor employment performance and its poor manufacturing performance. So that's on the domestic side. And on the international side, its kind of offensive interests have been in services, whereas the demand of virtually everybody who deals with them is to say, no, services, that's too difficult for us. Please open up your manufacturing sector for us. And so this was the narrative when India tried to negotiate with ASEAN as a whole. It was also the narrative when India negotiated with selective ASEAN members, particularly Thailand. And it was also the narrative in the WTO, in the Doha round. India said, look, our interest is in liberalization of trade and services, even though India chose not to participate in the GATS. And people said, no. We can assure you that the benefits of competition in your manufacturing sector are what you should really be pursuing. So it's been a bit of a dialogue of the deaf. So all of this was the background to the decision in 2019 to withdraw. Two things have happened, important things have happened since then, and I'll stop so that you can ask any follow-up questions. The first is that actually as far back as 2017 in Bhutan, but most acutely in June of this year, there has been military tension on the border with China. And this is a very important point, which is that both in China's, as it were, alliance with Pakistan and in its unresolved border with India, there's a security threat. which arguably you could say that the countries bordering the South China Sea face, but they have chosen to ignore that to proceed. And the consequence of this is that India has much more assertively than before signed up with the United States, Australia, and Japan in a security agreement called the Quad to, as it were, start developing understandings on the maritime front, because India is well positioned on the maritime side. So the paradox is that these security allies have had no difficulty in signing up with China, whereas India has. And let me just note also that India was the only country, including the United States, which flatly boycotted the Belt and Road in 2017, despite all kinds of blandishments from China. So I think, to sum up, India does see RCEP as a China-driven agreement. But I was interested in what Alicia had to say. India has been allergic towards trade agreements almost to the point of Donald Trump, feeling that it is not good at negotiating these things. It focuses on trade imbalances, particularly with China, rather than the overall balance of payments, which have been reasonably healthy, partly because of services, partly because of remittances. And finally, the Indian domestic private sector has persuaded the government that it is too weak to take on Chinese imports, despite the enormous implications of that for the competitiveness of Indian industry. So it's a complex story, but I just thought I'd sketch some of the points. Back to you.
Thank you, Suman. This is fascinating, and of course, a lot of things to unpack. And just for our listeners, the security pact that you referred to was in a Quad, right? Was a pact between Japan, Australia, the US, and India. So those four countries, and Japan and Australia, again, are part of ASEP, while India and the US are not. So it is quite an interesting development to see that on the security side, the assessment is completely opposite between those two parts of the security agreement. So I found that a fascinating point. And of course, the trade point is very well taken, that the manufacturing sector in India is quite weak, and the services sector, which perhaps is stronger and would have benefited more from liberalization, perhaps. I mean, there the little was on the menu. So in the end, the political dynamic in India was a bit skeptical on doing this agreement.
There are commentators in India on this, that after 20 years of look east and trying to come to terms with China, I think that the security imperative, given the new assertiveness of China, may force India to look west. And therefore, so I think a Biden administration, and equally in the EU, I think that there might be appetite, there may be momentum reestablished. But again, it is the case that the sorts of stipulations that certainly Europe will have on environment, on energy, on labor standards will be more demanding than the RCEP. There's no question.
Indeed, I'm afraid we don't have much more time to discuss. I mean, this is a very multidimensional topic, and I think we could only touch on a few issues and really get the issues from outside of Europe, really the voices from outside of Europe on this big debate and this big trade agreement. Europe will have to relate to it, will have to define a strategy. We have sketched a few first ideas, but certainly do stay tuned with Bruegel and look on our website as we develop our thinking and write more about this. If any of you wants to have one last word, please let me know. Alicia, do you want to say something to conclude our... And Uri, do you want to say really just one word, and then we conclude this talk? Alicia.
Yes, I understand that one way to look at this is the world is moving eastwards and Europe is kind of not catching up, and we should rethink our relation with China. But I think there is a logical gap in this. I buy the first, I buy the second, I don't think I buy the third. Meaning the fact that RCEP is there, to me, has no relation with our negotiations with China in terms of a comprehensive agreement on investment. It's a very different ballgame. I just want to make that very clear. However, I think Uri's suggestion to kind of Well, you were talking about, the existing agreement, but one could also talk about TTP. I mean, if Biden comes and says, I'm reviving this thing, I think Europe should say, I'm here with you. So, because it's not only about China, again, I think ASEAN is a huge market.
Yes, indeed.
And very complementary. So I don't mean to say no to China. That's not the point. But I don't think we can jump immediately to why? Because we're falling behind, we need to sign an agreement that has nothing to do with RCEP. So that was my comment.
No, I think it's a good point. Uri, one last thought and then we conclude.
Well, the arrival of the new Biden administration is prompting a lot of discussion in the US about what kind of stance to take towards China. And increasingly, there are warnings, most recently from Henry Kissinger, who is 97 years old, by the way, but his thinking is still very sharp, that in fact, in the final analysis, this Trump approach to China, which is to confront it across all possible fronts, could very easily lead to war. And there are many precedents, historical precedents to this. Okay, Japan and the United States in the 1930s, and Britain and Germany in 1913, 1914. So Biden will come in and demand a rethinking of the approach to China. And I would be very surprised if in the end, while taking a tough stance against China, no question about it, it will be this kind of outright confrontational approach. Very simply because Biden, if he wants to revitalize climate talks, if he wants to revitalize multilateralism, the WTO needs China. And this provides an opening for the European Union to rethink its approach to Asia and its approach to China. And the European Union might do well to take a page from the Japanese playbook. It's remarkable that Japan has been able to navigate these straits very, very well. They have a mini trade agreement with the United States and a sworn security alliance with the United States. And now they have a trade agreement with China, a very important trade agreement with China.
They have one with the EU, of course.
Sorry, and one with the European Union. And at the same time, they're collaborating with the European Union and the United States in the WTO on reforms on industrial subsidies, etc., which are clearly targeting China. So the message that Japan is giving, and indeed South Korea is giving, and to some extent Australia is giving, is you can play this game in a Trump world. In a Biden world, it will be easier and more constructive to do so.
Okay, I mean, I think we could discuss this issue for another hour, and I literally see you listeners. You don't see the faces of my colleagues here and how they want to react, but I can assure you that there's different views on how to engage with China, also at Bruegel and all across Europe. And I think it will be a part of a future series of blog posts as well as podcasts. Thank you so much to all of our listeners for tuning in. And please join our website at www.bruegel.org and listen and read more about these and related issues. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to our speakers for stimulating thoughts today. Bye-bye.